Solving the people problem. This is a good time to dive much deeper into the second problem that learning centers face, which I call the people problem. As I mentioned, the people problem is twofold. There are not enough leaders to open self-directed learning centers, and the leaders that start them quickly get burnt out. Without a leader, the learning center never opens. When a leader gets burnt out and quits, the center shuts down, leaving a lot of teens in a precarious position. Relying so much on a single individual creates an incredibly fragile system. We can address these two problems by moving away from a solo adult being the leader of our learning center and instead empower the youth themselves to be the leaders. Since the number of teens far outnumber the number of adults in any educational setting, this solves the problem of there not being enough leaders. We also avoid potential burnout by distributing the responsibilities of operating the learning center across all the teens, so that all the weight doesn't fall on one person's shoulders. At first, taking on all the responsibilities of the staff may sound like a very intimidating undertaking. However, please be reminded of what roles and responsibilities the staff members of a place like Sudbury School actually take on. As Brian Foglia, the staff member who started the South Jersey Sudbury School, shared previously, staff at Sudbury Schools are passive resources for the kids. We do not interfere in students' activities unless there is a safety issue or school rules are being broken. We do not even propose or recommend specific activities unless one or more students solicits that recommendation. We are available to help in any way if the students desire our help. Aside from that, we do all the administrative tasks necessary to run a school or business. Reference 190. We are mainly talking here about administrative tasks, some of which can be eliminated entirely by not becoming a legal business, some of which become the responsibility of the facility you're using, like the library staff, and some of which teens must take on themselves. To be clear, being a learning center instead of a school removes most of the administrative work. There is no need for attendance and grade reporting and all of the IEPs and 504s that teachers have to put together because you are not a school, you are a learning center. The greatest value that adults bring to the table is their non-administrative role in providing mentorship and guidance. I do agree with the Sudbury schools that sometimes adults can impose their interests on young people who simply aren't interested or feel like they must do what the adults want out of obligation. However, I don't agree that the solution is to mostly exclude adults from being involved in the learning center. Much like Ken Danford at North Star says, I think it's important that young people be empowered to say no to things they don't want to do. It's up to your group to decide how much involvement you want adults to have in your learning center as a whole, and up to each individual member of your learning center to decide how involved adults are in their lives. While it's obvious that people like librarians are already available to support you, you may be wondering how you can get other adults to volunteer their time to support your learning center. Fortunately, there is a roadmap available for this process. During my visit to Beacon Learning Center, which is a Liberated Learners Center in New Haven, Connecticut, I learned that a venture capitalist was teaching their biology class as a volunteer. It seemed unusual to have such an accomplished volunteer teach a class, and I was curious to learn more about where guest speakers like this man come from. Fortunately, I heard Joel Hammond explain why people love volunteering their time at learning centers when he appeared as a guest on Blake Bowles' podcast. He said, "Volunteers tell us, coming in here for an hour a week and working with a handful of kids who are really interested in what I have to offer is the best hour of my week. They love it. It's meaningful to them, and there's not a lot of opportunities for people to do that." Reference 191. Joel went on to describe how Princeton Learning Cooperative currently has 3 full-time staff, but there are about 35 part-time people involved in supporting the 30 teens who attend. Some of the part-timers are work-study college students who get paid through the university, but most are volunteers. Joel shared their clever recruitment process. We started a class last year. It's called Career Explorations. It's basically just an excuse for us to write to people. We just write to anybody. We have a handful of kids who are committed to having lunch on 1 day a week. We write to any interesting people we find out about in the community. We write to them and say, hey, Would you be interested in coming in for an hour to have lunch with a group of kids and talk about your career, what you're interested in, and how you got there? And we have about a 100% success rate. It doesn't matter who we write to. Reference 192. I emailed Joel asking for details, and he said the teens email interesting people in their community that they know about or see profiled in the local newspaper, or that they have researched because they have a particular expertise a teen is interested in, like a veterinarian. They invite the person in to visit for an hour during lunch, where the teens interview them about their career and life. If there's an interest from the teens, they'll then ask the volunteer to come in on a regular basis. If there's no interest, they don't follow up with the guest anymore. Reference 193. This brings up another reason why you should think of the library as your headquarters, rather than your entire learning center. It may be easy to get a volunteer to come into your location for a 1-hour event. But if you want repeated involvement, you may need to be willing to travel to where they are. Or you may have a volunteer with a job like a mechanic, who can share a lot in an hour at a library about their work, but it really makes sense to be on site at their location for future meetings and more detailed instruction. Regular meetings with a mechanic could easily lead into something like a regular apprenticeship or internship. I personally used a similar approach to reaching out to volunteers while organizing the Peer Unschooling Network's Create and Connect summer program. The program involved matching up teens with mentors in their respective field of interest for a 3-month period. In most cases, I asked for a full 3-month commitment from the mentors, which is a lot to ask for. Fortunately, I had a network of friends and colleagues I was able to reach out to who were willing to help. There were, however, 2 teens who were both interested in careers as writers, and I didn't have anyone in mind that I knew well enough to ask to volunteer as mentors for a full 3 months. I did, however, have a handful of people who I knew well enough to ask for an hour of their time. So I essentially proposed to run a virtual version of the career exploration class that Joel ran at Princeton Learning Cooperative. To give you something concrete, here is an example of an email I sent to Peter Gray to invite him to participate as a mentor in the Create and Connect program. Subject: Mentoring a couple young writers. Hi, Peter. As you may be aware, PUN is running an online program this summer called Create and Connect that matches young people up with mentors to help them create a project. We have 2 young people in the program who are avid writers that want to learn more about how to get their word out into the world. Would you be willing to have 1 or 2 hour-long group video calls with them to share your experiences as a writer and answer any questions they have? The program runs from June 23rd to September 13. We'd work within your flexibility, so if you can only meet once, that would work too. Please let me know if you're interested. Jim Flannery. Notice that I very clearly state why I am emailing him specifically with this request, because he is a writer. I also make it very clear exactly what I'm asking him for, to participate in 1 or 2 hour-long video calls. These 2 pieces are critical. It makes sure that the email is relevant to who you are writing to, and makes it very clear what the request is. I try to avoid too much extra information unless the person asks for it, because their time is valuable. If you're having trouble drafting your email, you can always ask the librarians for help. Just like Joel Hammond reported, when I sent out emails to potential volunteers, I had a 100% success rate of getting people to spend an hour meeting with a group of teens. I'll admit, I had 2 advantages over Joel. First, I was emailing people that I already knew, which increases the likelihood they'll reply. And second, since I was requesting video chat meetings, the volunteers didn't even have to leave their office to have the meeting. It made it quite difficult for them to say no. In your case, there's a good chance you'll be reaching out to people you've never met. This will likely reduce your success rate, but that is perfectly normal. Always look to see where there may be a way to find something connecting you and the person you are writing to increase your chances of getting a reply and a meeting. If you write to people who live in or near your community, they will likely feel a connection to you and your learning center, so be sure to emphasize your location. It will also help build connection when they know you are specifically interested in their field of work. It also never hurts to mention if you have a friend or relative in common. Mentioning you are a teenager is also important, as people tend to like helping out young people. If you can put these terms in your subject line, that also helps. As an example, something like Wethersfield teens interested in web development would have been a great subject line when I was a teen if I was trying to contact a complete stranger who was a web developer in my hometown of Wethersfield, Connecticut, to get some advice about computer programming. It's unlikely that every single teen at your learning center will find the perfect mentor already living in your neighborhood. It will happen sometimes, but not 100% of the time. You should plan to reach outside of your immediate community for volunteers as well. Just expect to have a lower success rate. It takes some vulnerability and courage to put yourself out there in the world and to keep pushing forward after hearing people tell you no, or, worse yet, having people never reply to you at all. Don't be discouraged. It's a normal part of the process. One possible tactic to increase your success rate in recruiting volunteers is to use snail mail to contact potential mentors and teachers. Most of the mail I receive is junk mail, but I always open any mail which has an envelope that is handwritten, which indicates to me that it is not junk. Just be sure that your handwriting is legible. Much like we discussed in the unschooling section, it is a good idea to ask volunteers for introductions to other potential volunteers. For example, if you have one person volunteer to talk about their experience as a professional musician, they likely know other musicians who would also be willing to come in and talk about their experiences. Asking them to introduce you to others is a great way to make a future connection. While we're talking about volunteers, let me make one important point. They don't necessarily need to be professionals. I've been mentioning volunteers as being professionals, or people who make a career out of their work, but there are also other people who are hobbyists who could provide value too. For example, I myself am not a professional physicist, but I love physics, am knowledgeable about it, and would love to meet with teens to discuss the subject. Same goes with public speaking, painting, stand-up comedy, rock climbing, hiking, and other interests of mine. Be resourceful and keep an open mind to who may be able to offer you some guidance and support. Retired professionals are also great resources too. Just last month, I took a 3D printing class at a local library that was taught by a retired engineer. He spent about 4 hours with me, one-on-one, teaching me how to use their new 3D printer. Because he was a retired professional, he was able to share with me all of the interesting applications for 3D printing in a real professional setting, as opposed to just theory. Sometimes, retired professionals can be far better than a trained teacher because of all their practical work experience. One last concrete idea to share with you about volunteers. The Hive, a self-directed learning center in Eugene, Oregon, started by Grace Llewellyn, just recently posted on their Facebook page looking for volunteers to teach classes. I thought this would be a useful example since it was directly from the real world as well. The post says, "We're starting to build out our fall calendar and seeking volunteer teachers for weekly 1-hour classes, 4 weeks or longer, so a 4-hour commitment. Is it you?" Our latest blog post muses on the fact that awesome adults tend to show up in self-directed education spaces. And then there is a photo of some teens at the Learning Center, and there is a link to an article called Labors of Love, which is written by Grace Llewellyn, highlighting the reason why adults enjoy working in self-directed learning centers. Reference 194. A quick warning about involving adults, especially if they are former teachers or parents. It's good to include adults as advisors, allies, coaches, mentors, consultants, supporters, and even invite them in to teach a class. But do not give them decision-making power over your group. This can become a very slippery slope as they can sometimes take over a group, believing, as most adults do, that they know better than you. People have often asked me why I am putting this audiobook app out before I've tested the idea of launching a teen-led zero-tuition learning center. The simple fact is that my leading the project would inherently reduce the decision-making power of the teens. I'm happy to offer guidance and suggestions, but it needs to be your learning center, not mine. This issue of allowing well-intentioned adults to participate without giving them decision-making power reminds me of a similar issue, which the psychiatric ex-patient survivor movement faced starting in the 1970s that still continues to this day. That movement deals with lots of oppression, coercion, and force. Doctors deem the so-called mental patients incapable of taking care of themselves and making their own decisions, which is incredibly disempowering. To counteract this oppression, activists started creating their own non-clinical alternatives to the mental health system, which they ran themselves. Almost immediately, clinical professionals tried to take over their spaces. Human rights activist Judy Chamberlain wrote in detail about this problem in her pioneering book, On Our Own: Patient-Controlled Alternatives to the Mental Health System. You can simply substitute the word adult or teacher everywhere she mentions professionals, and substitute teens or students anywhere she mentions patients or members. Although some professionals may be involved, their participation is deliberately limited by the members. Most mental health professionals, conditioned by their belief that patients are incapable of self-directed activity, cannot go along with the limited role allotted to them under the supportive model. Sometimes, professionals in this situation attempt more direction of the group than is needed or desired by the members. Many professionals deeply resent being excluded from meetings and activities of the group. In fact, this is one of the organizational problems with which any group attempting to set up as an alternative service will probably have to deal with early in its existence. The setting up of alternatives will frequently attract a number of well-meaning professionals and an immediate number of relatives, like parents. As we have seen, ex-patient consciousness raising cannot take place in such mixed groups. It must be up to the ex-patient members of the group to determine the degree that non-patients may participate. Those professionals and other non-patients who fight attempts by ex-patients to exclude them from some meetings are precisely the same people who will probably attempt to control and direct the group. Those non-patients who recognize the need for consciousness-raising meetings and don't object to being excluded from them are the only non-patients who can participate successfully. Reference 195. To be clear, I'm perfectly aware that I risk being perceived as hypocritical in presenting that you shouldn't let adults make decisions for you, while simultaneously presenting you with this guide for creating a learning center. Consider me a supportive ally, not a decision maker. Take this information and use it to serve your needs and your priorities, not mine.